Amid a freezing snowstorm, a lonely truck driver stumbles upon an injured German Shepherd mother and her 4 helpless puppies abandoned by the roadside. What tragic events led to their dire situation? Why was a once brave rescue dog cast aside so heartlessly? And could the driver's decision to save them not only change their fate, but also his own? The howling wind of the snowstorm whipped against the cab of Caleb Daniels' truck, rattling its windows as he navigated the icy highway. The world outside was a blur of white, the swirling snow blending into the grey sky. Caleb's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white beneath his weathered skin. The loneliness of the road was a familiar companion, but tonight it seemed heavier, more oppressive. It had been 6 months since his wife, Rebecca, had passed away in a car accident. 6 months of silence, grief, and endless highways. Caleb had taken every route he could find, crisscrossing the country in his red Peterbilt truck, trying to outrun the ache in his chest. But no matter how far he drove, her memory followed him. As Caleb's headlights pierced through the storm, something unusual caught his eye, a dark, motionless shape near the roadside. Squinting, he slowed the truck, unsure if it was debris or an animal. His heart sank when the shape shifted slightly, revealing a thin, trembling figure. A dog. Pulling to a stop, Caleb grabbed his coat and flashlight, bracing himself against the biting wind as he stepped out of the truck. The storm was unforgiving, the snow stinging his face and blurring his vision. As he approached, the figure came into focus. A German Shepherd, her fur matted with ice and dirt, crouched low to the ground. Around her, 4 tiny puppies huddled together, their small bodies shaking with cold. The sight was both heartbreaking and haunting. Caleb had seen stray dogs before, but this was different. The mother's eyes, a deep and piercing amber, locked onto his. They were filled with exhaustion and desperation, yet there was an undeniable glimmer of defiance, a refusal to give up, no matter the odds. "Hey there, girl," Caleb said softly, crouching a few feet away. His breath clouded in the frigid air as he tried to appear non-threatening. "What are you doing out here in this mess?" The dog didn't move, her body shielding her puppies as if to protect them from this strange intruder. Caleb noticed the slight limp in her front leg and the way her sides heaved with labored breaths. She was injured and starving, yet her determination to keep her pups alive was evident. Caleb's mind raced. He couldn't just leave them here. They wouldn't survive the night in this storm. But bringing them onto his truck wasn't an easy decision. The company had strict rules about keeping animals in the cab, and he was already running behind schedule. If he didn't make his delivery on time, he'd lose his job. He looked back at the truck, then at the dog and her puppies. "What do I do, Lord?" he murmured, his voice barely audible over the wind. The mother dog's eyes seemed to plead with him, as if she understood the weight of his hesitation. Caleb felt a pang of guilt twist in his chest. Rebecca had always been the one with a soft heart, the one who couldn't walk past a stray without stopping to help. She would never forgive him if he drove away now. "All right," Caleb said, his voice firm with resolve. He shrugged off his coat and carefully draped it over the shivering puppies. The mother growled softly, a warning, but Caleb kept his movements slow and deliberate. "Easy, girl. I'm here to help." One by one, he scooped up the puppies, cradling their fragile bodies against his chest. They were so small, barely more than skin and bones, but they nestled into the warmth of his jacket without protest. Once the puppies were safely in the truck, Caleb turned back for the mother. She stood now, her injured leg trembling under her weight. Caleb reached out a hand, palm up, letting her sniff him. "Come on, girl," he coaxed. "I've got a warm spot for you and your babies. Just trust me." After a moment's hesitation, the dog limped forward, her trust hard won, but given nonetheless. Caleb helped her into the cab, where she immediately lay down beside her puppies, curling her body protectively around them. Caleb climbed back into the driver's seat, slamming the door against the storm. The cab was warmer, but the air still carried the faint chill of desperation and uncertainty. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. Every minute spent here put him further behind schedule. But as he looked at the mother dog and her pups nestled together in the corner of the cab, Caleb knew he'd made the right choice. He couldn't explain it, but something about them felt important, almost fated. Reaching over, Caleb grabbed a spare blanket from behind the seat and draped it over the small family. "Looks like we're in this together now," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. The mother dog, whom Caleb decided to call Hope, lifted her head to look at him. For the first time, her eyes held something other than exhaustion, a flicker of gratitude, perhaps even trust. As the truck rumbled back onto the highway, Caleb's thoughts drifted. He wondered where Hope had come from, what had brought her and her puppies to such a desolate place. He couldn't shake the feeling that their paths had crossed for a reason, that this moment was part of a larger plan he couldn't yet see. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cab a fragile warmth began to grow. For the first time in months, Caleb felt a spark of something he thought he'd lost forever: hope. The highway stretched endlessly ahead of Caleb Daniels, winding through a desolate winter landscape shrouded in white. The snowstorm had calmed to a gentle fall, but the cold remained relentless, creeping into every corner of his truck. Caleb glanced at the bundle of life nestled in the passenger seat, a German shepherd mother he had named Hope, and her 4 tiny puppies. Hope lay with her head resting on her paws, her amber eyes half closed as she watched over her pups. They huddled close to her, small and fragile, but their breathing was steady, a sign that warmth and safety had begun to ease their suffering. Reaching over, Caleb grabbed a plastic bag of jerky from his glove compartment. He unwrapped a piece, broke it into smaller bits, and offered it to Hope. "Here, girl," he said softly. "It's not much, but it'll do for now." Hope hesitated for a moment, her gaze flicking between Caleb and the food. Slowly, she stretched her neck and took a piece from his hand, chewing it carefully before nudging one of the pieces toward her puppies. Caleb couldn't help but smile. "Always taking care of them first, huh? You're a good mum." The road was quieter now, the storm having driven most travelers to seek shelter. Caleb drove cautiously, the heavy load of his truck and the icy conditions demanding his full attention, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Hope. Who had abandoned her in such a cruel state? And why? Hours passed, and the strain of the journey began to take its toll. Caleb knew he couldn't keep going without a break, not for himself, and certainly not for Hope and her pups. Spotting a dimly lit sign for a roadside inn, he made his decision. The inn was small, a relic from another era, with peeling paint and a wooden porch half buried in snow. Caleb pulled the truck into the parking lot and stepped out, the crunch of his boots on the icy ground breaking the silence. He opened the passenger door carefully, wrapping the puppies in his spare blanket before carrying them inside. Hope followed closely, limping slightly, but refusing to let Caleb out of her sight. The innkeeper, an older man with a kind face and a shock of white hair, looked up from the front desk as Caleb entered. "You're brave in this storm, huh?" he said, his voice gruff but warm. His eyes shifted to the bundle in Caleb's arms and the dog at his side. "Well, I'll be. That's quite the crew you've got there." "They need help," Caleb explained, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "Do you have a warm spot we can use for the night, somewhere safe?" The man, who introduced himself as Henry, nodded and gestured toward the lounge area. "Set them down by the fire. I'll grab some towels." As Caleb settled the puppies on a soft rug near the hearth, Hope curled around them protectively. The heat from the fire quickly melted the frost from her fur, and for the first time, Caleb noticed the faint scars on her legs and body. These weren't just the marks of neglect, they were signs of a life lived in danger and resilience. When Henry returned, he carried a small box of medical supplies and knelt beside Caleb. "You're in luck," he said with a grin. Used to be a vet before I retired. Let's take a look at your friends here." Henry worked methodically, examining Hope and her pups with a practiced hand. As he checked her over, he noticed something embedded in her shoulder. "She's got a chip," he said, pulling out a scanner from his kit. Caleb watched intently as Henry scanned the chip and pulled up the data on an old tablet. The screen displayed a name and identification number: Hope, K9 Rescue Unit 047, Handler, Officer Daniel Matthews. Caleb blinked in surprise. "K9 Rescue? She was a working dog?" Henry nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, looks like she was trained for search and rescue missions. These dogs are heroes, you know. But sometimes, when they're injured or can't work anymore, well, not every handler does the right thing." The words hit Caleb harder than he expected. He thought of Hope out in the snow, fighting to keep her puppies alive, her scars, her limp. She had given everything she had, only to be abandoned when she could no longer serve. Henry continued, his tone softer now. "She's been through a lot, but she's a survivor, and so are those pups." As night fell, Caleb sat by the fire, lost in thought. The warmth of the flames cast a golden glow on Hope and her puppies, who were now fast asleep. He knew the logical thing to do was to take them to a shelter or rescue organization. They'd have the resources to care for them properly, find them homes. But the thought of parting with them felt wrong. Hope's unwavering trust in him, the way she had fought to keep her pups alive, it had stirred something deep within Caleb, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Rebecca's voice echoed in his mind, a memory from years ago. "Every life matters, Caleb. Sometimes God puts us in the right place at the right time for a reason." Henry's voice broke through his thoughts. "You've got a good heart, son, but taking care of a dog like her and 4 pups, it's a big responsibility. Are you ready for that?" Caleb looked at Hope, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. She had fought so hard for her family, and now it was his turn to fight for them. "I don't know if I'm ready," Caleb admitted, his voice quiet but resolute. "But I can't walk away from them. Not now." Henry smiled, a hint of approval in his eyes. "Well, if you're set on this, I'll help however I can. Let's start with getting them some proper food and supplies." The next morning, Caleb loaded Hope and her pups back into the truck, their bellies full and their bodies warm. Henry had packed a small box of supplies, food, medicine, and blankets, along with his blessing. As Caleb climbed into the driver's seat, he glanced at Hope. She met his gaze, her amber eyes steady and unyielding. In her, he saw a reflection of his own struggles and a reminder that resilience could lead to redemption. With the engine rumbling beneath him, Caleb pulled onto the highway once more, the road stretching endlessly ahead. But this time, he didn't feel so alone. Hope and her puppies were more than passengers. They were a new beginning. And though Caleb didn't know what challenges lay ahead, he felt a quiet certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be. The rumble of the truck's engine filled the quiet cabin as Caleb Daniels drove down a lonely stretch of highway. The snowstorm had long passed, leaving the landscape blanketed in white under a pale winter sun. In the passenger seat, Hope sat upright, her ears perked and her eyes scanning the horizon. Her pups, nestled in a crate Caleb had secured in the back, were fast asleep. There was something about Hope that Caleb couldn't quite place. She wasn't like any stray he'd ever encountered. Her posture was proud, her gaze sharp, and her every movement carried an air of purpose. It wasn't just her fierce devotion to her pups that intrigued him. It was the way she seemed to understand him, almost as if she were waiting for something. As Caleb pulled into the driveway of Henry's roadside inn, he noticed the older man waiting on the porch, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. The small wooden sign over the door swung gently in the breeze. Henry's Haven. Caleb had come to see this place as just that. A haven, not just for weary travelers, but for souls in need of healing. Henry greeted Caleb with a nod and helped him carry the pups and Hope back into the warm lounge. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the familiar scent of coffee and pine wood filled the air. "She's looking better," Henry observed, kneeling beside Hope and running his hands gently along her back. "Still a bit thin, but she's strong." Caleb crouched beside them. "She's more than strong. She's a fighter." As Henry examined Hope, his hand brushed against her shoulder and paused. "Hold on," he muttered, reaching for his scanner. "She's got a chip." Caleb blinked. "A chip? You mean she belonged to someone?" Henry nodded, already scanning the area. The small device beeped, and Henry pulled out an old tablet to access the data. Within moments, the screen lit up with information. Name, Hope, ID number, K9, Rescue Unit 047. Handler, Officer Daniel Matthews. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the name on the screen, his heart pounding. "Daniel Matthews?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Henry glanced at him. "You know him?" Caleb nodded slowly, his mind racing back to a time he thought he'd buried. "Daniel was my best friend growing up. We did everything together, school, church, even training for the academy. But he went into law enforcement, and I took a different path. We lost touch over the years." Henry studied Caleb's face, then looked back at the screen. "It says here she was assigned to him for search and rescue missions. Looks like they were quite the team." Caleb's eyes were fixed on Hope. The dog sat quietly, her amber eyes meeting his as if she knew exactly what was being said. "What happened to him?" Caleb asked, his voice tight. Henry hesitated before answering. "It says he passed away in the line of duty. Looks like he was trying to save someone during a flood rescue operation. The waters were too strong and, well, he didn't make it." Caleb felt a lump form in his throat. Memories of Daniel's laughter, his relentless optimism, and his unwavering faith flooded back. They had been inseparable once, and though life had pulled them in different directions, the bond they shared had never truly faded. Caleb sank into a chair by the fire, his hands gripping the armrests. Hope walked over to him, resting her head on his knee. Her touch was grounding, pulling him out of the storm of emotions swirling in his chest. "You stayed with him, didn't you, girl?" Caleb murmured, scratching behind her ears. "You were there until the end." Henry nodded thoughtfully. It's not uncommon for handlers to bond deeply with their canine partners. They rely on each other for survival. Losing him must have been as hard on her as it would have been on any human. Caleb looked at Hope, seeing her scars in a new light. She wasn't just a stray, she was a survivor, a hero who had lost her partner and been cast aside when she could no longer perform. It mirrored his own loss in a way he hadn't expected. That evening, Caleb sat alone with Hope while the pups slept nearby. The inn was quiet, save for the occasional pop of the firewood. Caleb pulled a small, weathered Bible from his jacket pocket. It had belonged to Rebecca, and though he carried it with him everywhere, he hadn't opened it in months. Flipping through the pages, he stopped at a verse she had underlined. "The Lord is close to the broken-hearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Psalm 34:18. Tears welled in his eyes as he closed the book and looked at Hope. "Maybe this isn't a coincidence," he said aloud. "Maybe Daniel sent you to me to remind me of who I used to be." Hope tilted her head, her ears twitching slightly at the sound of his voice. There was a quiet understanding in her gaze, as if she were saying, "I'm here for you." The next morning, Caleb helped Henry pack up supplies for the road, food for the pups, medical kits for Hope, and blankets to keep them warm. As he loaded the truck, Henry placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've got a good heart, Caleb," Henry said, "and maybe this dog came back into your life for a reason. Don't let her story end here." Caleb nodded, his grip tightening on the truck door. He looked down at Hope, who stood by his side, her pups wagging their tiny tails behind her. "I won't," Caleb promised. As the truck roared to life and pulled back onto the highway, Caleb felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The weight of his grief hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted, replaced by a purpose he hadn't felt in months. Hope wasn't just a dog. She was a link to his past, a symbol of resilience, and a reminder that even in the face of loss, there was still a reason to keep going. And as Caleb glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror, he couldn't help but feel that Daniel was watching over them, guiding their path forward. The highway stretched before Caleb Daniels like an endless ribbon, the snowbanks on either side shimmering under the pale morning sun. Inside the cab, the atmosphere was warm and quiet. Hope lay curled up in the passenger seat, her pups nestled against her side, their tiny chests rising and falling in peaceful slumber. Caleb glanced at them, his hands gripping the steering wheel. A faint smile crossed his lips, but it was short-lived. The weight of reality pressed against him. He was behind schedule, dangerously so, and his next stop wasn't getting any closer. The truck's radio crackled to life, jolting Caleb out of his thoughts. It was a call from his dispatcher at the freight company. "Daniels," the voice barked, "you're cutting it real close. If that shipment doesn't hit the drop point on time, don't bother coming back." Caleb's grip on the wheel tightened. He felt the heat rise in his chest, frustration mixing with the gnawing anxiety he'd been carrying since the storm. He couldn't lose this job. It wasn't just a paycheck. It was all he had left to hold on to after Rebecca's death. "I'll do my best," Caleb replied, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "You'd better," the dispatcher snapped before the line went dead. Caleb exhaled slowly, his eyes flicking back to Hope and her pups. They were safe now, but for how long? The supplies Henry had given him wouldn't last forever, and traveling with the dogs wasn't exactly part of the company's policy. His mind swirled with options. He could leave them at a shelter along the way, where they'd be cared for and hopefully rehomed. It would be the practical thing to do, logical, responsible. But as he looked at Hope's scarred body and her pups' fragile forms, his heart ached. Abandoning them felt like turning his back on something bigger than himself. Hope's amber eyes met his, steady and unyielding, as if she were asking him to make a choice that truly mattered. Caleb pulled the truck into a quiet rest stop, the engine rumbling softly as he turned off the ignition. Snow crunched under his boots as he stepped outside, the cold air biting at his face. He walked a few paces away from the truck, his breath forming clouds in the stillness. "Lord," he whispered, his voice breaking, "I don't know what to do. I've got these lives depending on me, and I've got my job on the line. I don't want to fail anyone. Please, show me the way." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't empty. As Caleb stood there, the memory of Rebecca's voice surfaced in his mind, soft and full of conviction. "Every choice we make should come from love, Caleb. That's how we know it's the right one." Tears stung his eyes as he turned back to the truck. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't abandon Hope and her pups. Not now. Not ever. Climbing back into the cab, Caleb felt a strange calm settle over him. He turned to Hope, who was now sitting upright, her ears perked. "Well, girl," Caleb said, his voice firmer now. "Looks like we're doing this together, no matter what it costs me." Hope tilted her head, her eyes bright with something Caleb could only describe as understanding. Caleb reached for his phone and made a call. When the dispatcher answered, he braced himself. "Listen," Caleb began, his tone steady but resolute. "I'm not going to make it on time. Something came up, something important. If you need to let me go, I understand, but I'm not leaving these dogs behind." The dispatcher was silent for a moment, then sighed. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" "Dead serious," Caleb replied. "Well, I hope they're worth it," the dispatcher muttered before hanging up. Caleb set the phone down, a mixture of relief and apprehension washing over him. He had no idea what the fallout would be, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was doing the right thing. Over the next several hours, Caleb focused on the immediate task at hand, caring for Hope and her pups. He stopped at a small-town feed store where the owner, a kind woman in her 60s, helped him pick out supplies. "These are for your dogs?" she asked, smiling as she handed him a bag of high-quality dog food. "They're not mine," Caleb admitted, "but they're with me for now." The woman nodded knowingly. "Sometimes they choose us before we're ready to choose them." Caleb couldn't help but chuckle at her words, feeling the truth in them. Back in the truck, he spread out fresh blankets for the pups and refilled their water bowl. Hope ate heartily for the first time, her strength visibly returning. As the hours passed, Caleb found himself talking to her as if she could understand every word. "You've been through a lot, haven't you, girl? But you didn't give up. You kept going, even when it was hard." Hope listened intently, her eyes fixed on him. Caleb realized he wasn't just talking to her, he was talking to himself, drawing strength from her resilience. That night, as Caleb parked the truck at another rest stop, he sat quietly with Hope beside him. The pups were sleeping soundly, their tiny bodies curled into one another. Caleb opened Rebecca's Bible again, flipping through the pages until a verse caught his eye. "Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due when it is in your power to act." Proverbs 3:27. The words resonated deeply, solidifying the choice he had made. He couldn't control the future, but he could control the present. And in this moment, his responsibility was clear. He looked down at Hope and smiled. "We'll figure it out, girl. 1 mile at a time." The hum of the truck engine filled the early morning air as Caleb Daniels pulled into the driveway of Henry's Haven one last time. The old inn had become an unexpected refuge, not just for Caleb, but for Hope and her pups. Now, as the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, Caleb felt the weight of his next steps settling on his shoulders. Inside, the pups were lively, their small bodies bounding over the soft rugs near the fire. Hope sat nearby, her gaze watchful and calm, the scars on her body a testament to her resilience. Caleb crouched down, rubbing her ears. "We've got a big day ahead, girl," he said softly. "It's time to find these little ones a home." Henry, ever the steady presence, had already arranged for a few families to meet the pups. "You're lucky," he said, handing Caleb a piece of paper with addresses. "I know 2 families nearby who'd be perfect. One's got a big backyard, and the other has kids who've been begging for a dog. These pups are going to be spoiled." Caleb nodded, his heart heavy but hopeful. It wasn't easy to let them go, but he knew it was the right thing to do. The first stop was a cozy farmhouse a few miles away. The owners, a middle-aged couple named Tom and Linda, greeted Caleb warmly. They had lost their own German shepherd the previous year and were eager to welcome a new member to their family. As one of the pups tumbled clumsily across their porch, Linda's laughter rang out. "Oh, you're going to fit right in here," she said, scooping the little one into her arms. The second stop was at a suburban home where 2 young children, Ella and Jack, squealed with delight as Caleb arrived. Their parents, kind and attentive, assured Caleb that the pup would have all the love and care it could ever need. Watching the children cuddle the tiny dog, Caleb felt a warmth he hadn't known in months. "Be good, little guy," he whispered as he handed over the second pup. "You're in good hands now." By the end of the day, Caleb returned to the truck with 2 pups still in tow. Hope, who had been waiting patiently, greeted him with a wag of her tail and a soft bark. Caleb crouched beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "These 2, he said, gesturing to the remaining pups. "They're staying with us. You've been through too much to let go of all your family." Hope nuzzled Caleb's hand, her amber eyes filled with gratitude. The next morning, Caleb braced himself as he drove back to the freight company's headquarters. The dispatcher's warning still echoed in his mind, but he was determined to face whatever came next. When he arrived, the yard was bustling with trucks and workers. Caleb parked his rig and climbed down, Hope and her pups close behind. Heads turned as the dogs trotted alongside him, their presence an unusual sight in the industrial setting. His boss, Frank Wheeler, stepped out of the office, arms crossed and a stern expression on his face. Caleb took a deep breath and approached him. "Frank," Caleb began, "I know I didn't meet the deadline, and I know company policy doesn't exactly allow passengers," he gestured to Hope and the pups, "but I couldn't leave them behind. If you need to let me go, I'll understand." Frank stared at him for a moment, then looked down at the dogs. Slowly, his expression softened. "You've got some nerve, Daniels," he said, shaking his head, "but you've also got a good heart. I heard about what you did, taking in these dogs during the storm. That's not something most people would have done." Caleb blinked, surprised. "You're not mad?" "Mad? Maybe a little," Frank admitted, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "But I'm also impressed. You've got a knack for taking care of things that need saving. And besides," he added, reaching down to scratch one of the pups behind the ears, "I'm a sucker for dogs." Caleb let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "So, I'm not fired?" Frank laughed. "Not fired. In fact, I've got a new route for you. It's a little longer, but I think you'll like it. And if you want to bring your passengers along for the ride, well, I won't stop you. Just make sure they're secured." Over the following weeks, Hope and her pups became an integral part of Caleb's life on the road. Hope often rode shotgun, her ears twitching as she watched the world pass by through the windshield. The pups, growing stronger and more adventurous by the day, had their own space in the back of the cab, complete with blankets and toys. At every stop, they became local celebrities. Gas station attendants, truckers, and travelers alike would stop to pet them, their faces lighting up at the sight of the little family. Caleb even found himself smiling more, the weight of his grief slowly lifting. Hope, for her part, seemed to thrive in her new role. No longer burdened by fear or exhaustion, she exuded a quiet strength that inspired everyone she met. One evening, as the truck idled in a rest area under a sky full of stars, Caleb sat outside with Hope by his side. The pups tumbled around them, yipping playfully as they wrestled in the grass. Caleb looked at Hope, his hand resting on her head. "We've come a long way, haven't we, girl?" he said softly. "And I think we've got a lot more miles ahead of us." Hope leaned into his touch, her amber eyes shining with contentment. In that moment, Caleb felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. Hope and her pups weren't just passengers on his journey. They were a part of his family, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was always a reason to keep going. Caleb Daniels' life was no longer defined by the lonely stretches of road or the echoes of his past. With Hope and her 2 remaining pups by his side, his days were filled with purpose and warmth he hadn't known in years. Each journey in his red Peterbilt truck became more than just a job. It became a mission to share the love and kindness that had been restored in his heart. At every stop, people would gather to meet Hope and her pups, drawn to their story of survival and second chances. Caleb would share their journey, not as a tale of loss, but as a testament to resilience and redemption. Hope became a symbol of the unwavering faith that even in the darkest times, light could be found. One quiet evening, parked under a blanket of stars, Caleb sat beside the campfire outside his truck. Hope lay at his feet, the pups curled up beside her. He opened Rebecca's well-worn Bible and read aloud, "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." Galatians 6:9. Caleb looked at Hope, his voice soft. "You're my harvest, girl. You reminded me that God's blessings don't always come when we expect them, but they're always right on time." As the flames danced in the cool night air, Caleb bowed his head in a quiet prayer. "Lord, thank you for bringing Hope into my life. Thank you for reminding me that no act of kindness is ever wasted, and that your love is always with us, guiding us even when we feel lost. I pray for everyone who needs a little hope in their lives. May they find it just as I did. Amen." Caleb and Hope's journey reminds us that small acts of kindness can ripple out to create powerful changes. It teaches us that faith, patience, and love can mend even the deepest wounds. God works in mysterious ways, and his blessings often come disguised as challenges. So when life feels overwhelming, remember, there's always hope, and God's grace is never far away. If Caleb and Hope's story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share their journey with others, and let it be a reminder of the power of compassion and faith. Together we can spread love, kindness, and the belief that every life, human or animal, matters. May God bless you and your loved ones, and may his light guide your path, just as he guided Caleb and Hope to each other.